This is the second of a 2-video series on the King's Indian defence which I've prepared for you. Together, the videos form a complete repertoire for black in this opening. Now, continuing the overall dynamic thrust of video 1, I've prepared exciting, challenging responses for black to firstly the Averback and related systems, and then secondly the classical and related systems. The emphasis is very much on black going all out for the win. The Averback system begins as follows. White plays knight c3, bishop g7, e4, d6, bishop e2, black castles, and then the characteristic move of the system, bishop g5. Now, a white player of the Averback system is likely to be an open-minded, flexible character, thus the most dangerous possible opponent. White is challenging black to find counterplay against his balanced setup, and indeed it's difficult to do so. Should black play h7, h6 or not? Should he aim for c5? Or should he aim for e5? And if the centre becomes blocked, let's say in a position like this, White has the automatic plan on the king side of attacking with his pawns. White will push his pawns up to g4 and h4, on to h5, profiting from the fact that the knight on g1 is as yet undeveloped and doesn't block the bishop on e2 from protecting the pawn at g4. So these are the problems to be faced. Now, in this video I'm going to recommend an unusual system for black, but one which I believe to be perfectly playable. And that starts with the move knight c6. It's a very unusual idea of the Hungarian grandmaster Bilek, and a very old idea actually, almost forgotten I would think. If you play this move you'll certainly surprise your opponents. I analyse the following lines. The first move for white worth consideration is the natural knight f3. Black plays h6. This is the main idea, to give white's bishop a kick, to drive it away, and to then perhaps follow up with e5 if allowed. Accordingly, in the game Ferenc Portis versus Bilek, Hungarian Championship 1971, white played bishop takes knight, and black played pawn takes bishop, which I think is an excellent move. d5, knight e7, white castled, and then black opened up with f5 and had an excellent game. In particular, the bishop on g7 is very strong here. The critical test of black's idea must begin with the move d5. Then black should play knight e5, and we're now going to follow the game Korchnoi versus Kasparov, Madrid 1989. In this position Korchnoi played knight f3. And Kasparov played knight takes f3 check. Just retracting that move, in the game Sappi versus Bilek, Hungary 1971, instead of knight takes f3, black played h6. Then came bishop e3, knight f g4, bishop d2, and black went f5. White played h3 to try and get rid of black's knight, and black took on f3 with check, vacating the e5 square, the knight on g4. So bishop takes f3, knight went to e5, bishop e2, and black played f4, cementing the knight in on e5 with a very good game. Back to Korchnoi-Kasparov now, where you'll remember in place of h6, Kasparov took on f3 with check. Bishop takes f3, And now black played h6. Well, you can see that the move knight c6 was rather provocative, and in fact black has lured white's pawn forward to d5. That's got advantages going for it, because white's gained a bit of space. The disadvantage is, of course, that the bishop on g7 now has the long diagonal to play with. Bishop e3 was played by Korchnoi, and Kasparov played e6, intending to draw up some counterplay. White castled, and then came rook e8. Rook c1, e takes d5, c takes d5, and black played c5. Well, there's no real choice here for white. Having played his rook to c1, he should certainly open up the game and try and give the rook a bit of scope. So Korchnoi took en passant. D takes c6, b takes c6, and white played e5, opening up the bishop on f3 against the pawn at c6. Black's next move is forced. Rook takes e5, and then came bishop f4. Rook e6, bishop takes c6, and then rook b8. Well, it's true that white does have the better pawn structure. You could argue that his pawns on a2 and b2 are stronger and more easy to support than black's pawns on a7 and d6. But what certainly must be mentioned is black's activity, and this is what Kasparov likes about the black position. The rook on b8 is active, the rook on e6 is active, and black's bishop on c8 threatens at any stage to come to a6, with again a very active position. So even Viktor Korchnoi couldn't prove any advantage against black's original and daring opening. Now the most aggressive line for white is undoubtedly d5, knight e5, f4. Here white's using the black knight as a target and hopes to gain space and time by pushing the knight around. That's the good thing about white's play. As black, I would argue that white is loosening his position by playing moves like f4 early on, and that we can take advantage of that with accurate moves. For instance, the best move after f4 is just to drop the knight back to d7, and after knight f3 to play c6. Now that's not so much a move which chips away at the white centre, although it does, and it's very useful because it does so, but I think black is actually threatening to go a move like queen b6, and as you can see the queen is very strong on b6, pressurising the pawn at b2 and creating enormous threats down the diagonal to f2 on e3 and f2. For instance, the move knight g4 would come very much into consideration here from black's point of view. Now if we just drop back after c6, if white castles, then I think black has a very promising position, queen b6 check, and if king h1, you can consider either knight g4 straight away, or probably better, just to go straight down and take that b pawn. I don't see any white compensation after queen takes b2. So a better move for white, instead of castles after c6, is queen d2. But then again, I think black plays queen b6. With this move, I think black equalises the chances. In place of queen b6, he could also have tried knight c5, but queen b6 is, I think, a lot stronger, because black gives himself the option now of playing knight c5, hitting white's e-pawn, and then reinforcing the knight with a5, and I don't see that white has anything at all in this position, apart from a weakened pawn structure. A final move for white, after knight c6, is a natural queen d2. But then I think black plows straight through with the move e5, a move that knight c6 prepared. And if d5 now, then black can consider coming into d4, perhaps shoring up that knight with c5, if necessary. Or he may just drop back to e7 with a kind of traditional King's Indian position. Of the two, I would prefer knight d4. So there you have it, uncharted territory against the Averbach system. Knight c6, and black's going to follow up with e5 if allowed, possibly h6 will be thrown in somewhere, and a highly unusual game results. I think black's doing okay in this line. Another system involving the move bishop g5, very popular at present, starts with the moves knight c3, bishop g7, e4, d6, h3, black castles on the king side, and now bishop g5. This is a kind of attempt to get an improved Averbach system. And against this setup, I'm going to recommend the move c5. White normally plays d5 and then e6. Now comes bishop d3, e takes d5, e takes d5, and then knight b d7. White prepares castling with knight f3, and here we have the start of the main line position, where black should play rook e8 check. Now the check is slightly embarrassing for white. He's brought all his minor pieces out to good squares, and in particular the bishop on g5 is good, tying down the knight on f6. But if he now has to play bishop e3 to block the check, or for instance bishop e2, then it turns out that he's wasted a tempo. So Mihai Suba, Romanian grandmaster, very original player, his idea in this position was to play king f1. And white's intention after that funny move is to go g4, king g2 and queen d2, with more space and the opportunity of controlling the e-file later on with, for instance, rook a e1. It's not so easy for black to escape white's grip if black lets white get this type of position. Accordingly, black must play very aggressively against a move like king f1 and try and blow the game open before white gets a chance to go through with this logical but slow plan. So we're going to follow the game now, Suba against Ullmann, Berlin 1979, where after king f1 black played a6. Now the idea of this is clear. Black's going to sacrifice with b7, b5 if white lets him and open up the game. Suba didn't like that possibility, so he played a4 to try and restrict black. And Ullmann played knight e5. Good move, I think, unjamming black's minor pieces, unjamming the queen side. Knight takes e5 happened, rook takes e5, and Suba protected the bishop on g5 with queen d2. Then came bishop d7, which at first sight looks like a mistake, but in fact it's an excellent dynamic move. Ullmann knew exactly what he was doing when he played this move. Well, Suba played bishop f4 and black played rook e8, and it looks as though black is actually just losing a pawn here, the pawn on d6. And Suba, funnily enough, he didn't take the pawn, he played a5. Now we should see what happens if he takes the pawn. So just retracting the move a5, if white had played bishop takes d6, then I think black would have played b5, with the following continuation. A takes b5, A takes b5, rook takes a8, queen takes a8. Now white has some problems on the back rank. King g1, queen a6, hitting the bishop on d6, bishop takes c5, and now the move b takes c4. with excellent compensation for a measly pawn. Actually, white's position is rather difficult here, due to black's active play. For instance, if now bishop f1, then a good move, for instance, is just knight e4. Knight takes knight, rook takes knight, and black's dynamic development gives him the advantage. Returning to the position after a5, Allman played the excellent move b5. Now the only way you're going to exploit the artificiality of a move like king f1 is to play actively, and in particular you've got to play actively while that king remains on f1. You can't let white consolidate his space advantage. So Allman's move is excellent. He's trying to keep the white king pinned down in the centre. Summing up, against the system with h3 and bishop g5, I recommend the move c5. If then d5, e6, bishop d3, and then taking on d5, e takes d5, knight b d7, waiting for white to develop the knight on g1 before landing a check on e8. The secret, if white ever plays a move like king f1, is to try and blow the position open as quickly as possible with b5 and play actively before the white king gets a chance to consolidate. A similar system for white, involving h3, begins 5h3, black castles, and then in place of bishop g5, as we saw in the last example, white plays knight f3. Very popular system these days with top grandmasters. Essentially white is trying to restrict the black position. Now to keep things as simple as possible, I'm going to recommend a similar line to the last example. I think black should play c5 in this position. And then after d5, e6, bishop d3, e takes d5 is the move, and then if e takes d5, rook e8 check. Then comes bishop e3, and we reach the critical position. Now here, if black's not careful, he can get into trouble developing his queenside pieces. So I'm going to recommend what at first sight looks like almost a beginner's move, but actually turns out quite well. I'm going to recommend the move bishop f5. Now this looks quite ridiculous, because it allows white to play bishop takes f5, g takes f5. And you can bet your last penny that most white players are going to do that against you. Now the main point of this position is that white can't play an immediate move like queen c2, attacking the weak pawn on f5. Black is actually threatening the move f4, winning the bishop. So the best move for white here is simply to castle. And now black reveals the point of his play. He wants to play knight e4. Well, this is a key move in the King's Indian, in particular opening up the bishop on g7. That's the main idea. And look how the pawn on f5, that supposedly weak pawn, is supporting the strong knight on e4. We'll now follow a brief snippet from the game Hubner against Shirov, Manila Interzonal 1990. White took the knight on e4, knight takes e4, f takes e4, and played knight d2. Now Shirov played knight d7, and here I feel that black already has quite a good position. The bishop's bearing down on b2, the pawn on e4 is quite embarrassing for white, and I think black is threatening to reinforce this pawn with, for instance, f5, followed by knight e5, and then knight d3. So Hubner-Shirov continued queen g4, and white tried to stop black from enacting his plans. Now I think black should have played queen e7, with the ideas, firstly bishop h6 can be answered by f5, And secondly, if white plays neutrally with a move like rook b1, then black tucks his king in the corner with king h8, and will play certainly either queen e5, followed by f5, if allowed, or bishop d4, followed by knight f6 and rook g8, with typical Benoni play. The classical main line of the King's Indian begins as follows. In the diagram position, white plays knight f3 and black castles. Now the first variations I'm going to deal with in this section are the boring exchange variation lines, and there are two of them, but neither of which should give black any trouble. First up, there's an old variation of Larsen, after bishop e3, which intends after e5 to just play d takes e5, d takes e5, queen takes d8, rook takes d8, and then knight d5. Now Larsen used this system in the 60s to win a lot of important tournament games, but it's not very dangerous. Here black should reply, after knight d5, simply knight a6. And I offer the following analysis. If white castles on the queen side, then black plays bishop g4, intending just c7, c6, with an equal game. If white plays the innocuous knight takes f6 check, then we get bishop takes f6, bishop e2, and again the key move, c6, just keeping the white pieces out of d5, and black can look forward to the knight manoeuvre, knight c7, to e6, and eventually knight d4, again with a perfectly playable game. If white decides to play aggressively as he can possibly play in this position, and tries bishop g5, then we get rook d6, knight takes f6 check, bishop takes f6, bishop takes f6, rook takes f6, knight takes e5, then simply rook e6 will gain back the pawn, again with at least an equal game in view of black's superior development. And finally, if bishop g5, rook d6, white tries to maintain the knight on d5 by playing bishop takes f6, bishop takes f6, castles on the queen side, then I think black can simply retreat with the calm bishop g7 with the following line. Knight e7 check, king f8, knight takes c8, rook takes d1 check, king takes d1, and then rook takes c8 with a completely equal game. The so-called main line exchange variation begins. Bishop e2, e5 by black, this is the move I'm going to recommend throughout this section, and then white insipidly takes the pawn off, d takes e5, with the idea d takes e5, queen takes d8, rook takes d8, bishop g5, setting up the threat of knight d5. Now if white wants absolutely anything at all with exchange variations, he'd better play it like this. There are other really insipid ways to play, but the main positional point is that black can keep the white pieces out of d5 with c6 at some point, whereas white can't keep black pieces out of d4. For instance, if we imagine the knight on b8 hopping into d4, then you can see the sort of thing which black is aiming for in exchange variations, in an ideal world. Now in the position after bishop g5, I'm going to recommend the new move, c6. I also think it's the best move. This is a lively new idea involving a pawn sacrifice. A pawn sacrifice which white probably does best to take initially, but then give back the pawn a little later on. We're now going to follow the game Korchnoi versus Kasparov, Tilburg 1991. Korchnoi played knight takes e5. Retracting that move, the other idea for white is the very boring castles on the king side. The safest route for black then is to unpin with rook e8, and after rook a d1, to follow up with knight b d7. I consider this position to be completely equal. Black's plan should be something along the following lines. Either a5, knight c5, knight f d7 to protect the e-pawn, knight e6, and then eventually knight d4. That's one way of getting the knight into d4. Or the other way could be knight f8, again the retreat to d7 with the f6 knight, keeping the e-pawn under surveillance, knight e6, and then the familiar route to d4 is well mapped out. So back at Korchnoi Kasparov, of course white played the only critical move, knight takes e5. Then theory gives rook e8, castles on the queen side. Now there are other moves here, so we should retract castles on the queen side and have a look at them. The first move to be considered is f4, reinforcing the knight on e5. When black should play knight a6. Now this is quite interesting. Black intends knight c5, ganging up on white's e4 pawn. So the game, Karlak versus Koprechik, Berlin 1987, after knight a6, continued castles on the queen side, h6, bishop h4, g5, a good move this I think, f takes g5, h takes g5, bishop g3, and now knight c5. This manoeuvre knight a6 to c5 is worth absorbing. Rook h, e1, and then Koprechik played bishop e6. Actually, black has a good game here, despite the fact he's a pawn down. He's got excellent coordination, and he already threatens the e-pawn. Well, Karlak couldn't find anything better than playing bishop f1, and after knight h5, black actually had the better game. He's threatening to take the bishop off on g3, followed by taking the knight. And, well, for instance, after knight f3, black can give white an absurd pawn formation by simply playing knight takes g3, h takes g3, and then chopping on c3. With, as far as I can see, 6 isolated white pawns. Back to the position after rook e8, and in Buaz's Nun Sirac Interzonal 1987, white played bishop f4. Nunn played knight a6, again this familiar manoeuvre coming into c5. And the game went on. Castles on the queen side, knight c5, f3, and now that the path of the bishop on e2 has been blocked, Nunn played knight h5, this familiar idea once again, hitting at this bishop on f4. Bishop e3 happened, and now Nunn cleverly regained his pawn with knight takes e4. Knight takes e4, bishop takes e5, bishop d4, and then bishop f5 happened. Bishop takes e5, rook takes e5, knight c3, and now knight f4, with a small advantage to black. After bishop f1, black will probably double up with, for instance, rook a e8. So back to the game Korchnoi-Kasparov, and of course Victor Korchnoi plays the critical line, which is castles on the queen side, knight a6 by black, and now rook to d6. Now for a while, a few years ago, it looks as though this move would pose black quite a few problems, might even render the move c6 unplayable. But Kasparov, of course, played the best move here, which is bishop e6, and it's a move which I think brings black fully into the game again. The point is that after knight f3, black should play knight g4 with excellent compensation. For instance, most obvious white moves, such as knight d1, bishop h4, or rook f1, are met by knight c5, with threats to the e-pawn. Actually, it's not at all an easy position for white to defend. For instance, just to give you a sample line, if bishop h4, knight c5, and then white doubles up on the d file, rook h d1, then simply bishop takes c3, b takes c3, knight takes e4, and black has a winning position, out of nowhere. So back at Korchnoi-Kasparov, and Korchnoi played f4, reinforcing his knight after bishop e6. Now in this position, black could have played knight c5, if he wanted to, that would have been a good move, but instead, Kasparov played h6, with the intention that if bishop h4, then g5, with familiar tactics. So white took on f6, black recaptured, and white doubled up, rook h d1. Bishop takes e5, f takes e5, and now black produced a peculiar move, rook a c8. Now the point of this move is that at some stage in this game, black is going to win the pawn on e5. He'll probably do this by doubling up his rooks, for instance with rook c7 to e7. So that's the first point of the move. But you have to ask yourself, as black, what is white doing in this position? And I think white's main idea is to play his knight into d5, sacrificing a knight in order to gain a strong phalanx of central pawns. So black's last move anticipates this threat, so that if white plonks his knight in now, c takes d5 uncovers a pin down the c-file on white's king. So should white want to play knight d5, he's got to preface that move with, for instance, bringing his king into the centre, when of course the king is okay for the endgame, but with pieces on the board it's less securely placed than it would be on c1. Summing up, I would say that the exchange variation, particularly in this guise, doesn't really pose black any problems. Once you come to this position, play c6, and then remember the main idea is knight a6 to c5, putting pressure on white's e-pawn. You may go a pawn down for a little while, for instance after knight takes e5, rook e8, castles on the queen side, but in conjunction with this knight a6 to c5 manoeuvre, don't forget you've got a virtually fireproof pawn structure, and there are chances, as you saw in an earlier example, to mess white's pawn structure up beyond recognition. So good luck with this idea. I think c6 is an excellent move, and a perfect answer to this tedious exchange line. The Petrosian system begins bishop e2, e5, and then white blocks the centre with d5. Now actually this system went out of favour for a long while, but it's been recently coming back into fashion with many grandmasters. I'm going to recommend the move here a5 as best. Now this is an anticipatory move, because black is expecting white to expand on the queen side later in the game, and this move will hold him up, or at least black hopes so. Added to which, black is going to play a knight, if he can, round to c5, And then the move a5 is contributing in that white can't get rid of black's strong knight by playing b4. So there are 2 points to the move a5. There's more to black's position than that though. I think eventually black is looking to attack white on the king side. It's just that he takes time out initially to hold white on the queen side, and it's a preparatory idea rather than something immediately aggressive. So we'll now follow the game Gulko versus Kasparov, Novgorod 1995, a very recent game which shows the best way for black to play. Gulko played bishop g5, and this is the characteristic Petrosian move. It's important that black hits the bishop now with h6. If he didn't, white might have played queen d2, preventing that move forever. So h6, bishop h4, and then knight a6. So here we see more of that preparatory play. Notice that black has pushed white's bishop away from the centre, so that if the black knight ever comes to c5, it takes a long time for white's bishop to get actually on the knight, to attack the knight, to threaten to remove it. So knight a6, holding white up on the queen side. And Gulko played knight d2. Kasparov played bishop d7. White castled. And then comes another key move, queen e8. Another useful move in many ways. Black gets out of the pin on the knight at f6, and when he moves that knight, for instance knight h7 at some point, he's always going to be threatening the move f5, which is his eventual idea, I think, in this line. White played king h1. This is a slightly unusual move. Very long term. I think more common in this position, in place of king h1, will probably be either a3 or b3, preparing an eventual b4, for instance, something like this. After king h1, Kasparov played knight h7, and white played a3, preparing to play on the queen side. Now black plays a slightly surprising move. He plays h5. Well, it's a little trap, obviously, because black is threatening to swamp the bishop on h4 with g5. For instance, if white made a neutral move here on the queen side, let's say rook b1, then g5 actually wins that bishop on h4. Bishop g3, h4. So the move h5 may turn out to be useful, contributing to black's kingside attack later on, and at the same time it distracts white from his queenside advance. So it's a useful move all round. Gulko saved his bishop with f3. This is a common idea in the Petrosian system. The bishop's going to drop back to f2, maybe supporting the move c5 at some point. So this is quite a good move by white. And now comes a new move by Kasparov. The normal move in this position, the hitherto recommended move, was bishop h6, intending, for instance, bishop e3. Then, far from being a bad bishop, the bishop looks quite strong there in the centre of white's position. But Kasparov played, instead, bishop f6, a new move. And Gulko took that bishop. Bishop takes f6. It's worthwhile seeing what would have happened had he gone bishop f2. Now I think in this position Kasparov would have played bishop g5, with the main idea that now the bishop's activated he's going straight for the move f5. And then we could get the following line. Rook b1, f5, b4, a takes b4, a takes b4, and then h4, with an unclear game. I quite like black's chances on the king side. So Gulko decided to take that bishop on f6. I presume the idea was that now, after knight takes f6, it takes black a little while to arrange to play f5. In the meantime, white's pressing ahead on the queen side. Gulko played b3. Possibly, rook b1 looks more direct. But then I think black will probably play a4. And now it's difficult for white to force through the move b4 without allowing black to capture en passant. I think if the pawn remains on a4, then black can look forward to playing knight c5, and then the knight is well and truly cemented in on c5. White shouldn't allow that. So b3, and Kasparov continued with patient preparation for the kingside attack. He played queen e7, queen e1. That's a useful move by white, looking at both sides of the board, because look, the queen can maybe come out to h4 one day, or it may support the advance b4 one day. So a useful move on two counts. Now black played king g7. Now white should probably have played rook b1, but instead he tried queen f2. And black played a cunning move here, h4. The point of this move is that should white take the pawn, with queen takes h4, black would have played knight takes d5, uncovering an attack on the white queen. Queen takes the queen, knight takes on e7. And I think black has the better game here. First of all, the bishop on d7 is so much better than white's bishop. White's bishop is in fact hemmed in by his own colour pawns. And black has several ways of penetrating to the weak dark squares on d4 and f4. For instance, knight c5 to e6, and the knight can choose between going to f4 or d4. That's one manoeuvre. More directly, black can play knight c6 to d4. So there are ways and means of penetrating into white's position, should white have taken the pawn on h4. So after h4, Gulko played f4, trying to create some pressure on the f-file. But then came e takes f4, queen takes f4, and now h3. Well, surprisingly, this position is difficult for white, because he's got no grip on the dark squares. For instance, black's got a grip on the e5 square and the c5 square. And I think the main positional point is that white's bishop is actually quite bad here, locked in behind his own pawns, and black's bishop has the run of the board. The remaining moves of this model game can be found in the booklet. Summing up, a5 is a logical and flexible response to the problems posed by the Petrosian system. Black holds white on the queen side and develops his counterplay slowly on the other flank. The Gligorich system begins with the move bishop e3, and this is a pretty good idea. White is tempting black into playing knight c6, d5, knight e7, when knight d2 gives white the upper hand. Either white stifles black with g2, g4, or the bishop on e3 is very well placed to support c4 to c5. Maybe white can put both of those plans into operation. If black tries to do something fast, then the white pieces are all in good positions. If both sides develop normally, the three-pawn centre gives a useful space advantage. So we're going to concentrate on a relatively uncomplicated way of tackling the problem. I recommend black should play pawn takes pawn here. Now the main line goes as follows. Knight takes d4, rook e8, attacking the e-pawn. Now white has a choice. He almost always plays the move f3, supporting the pawn. But we should know what happens if he plays instead queen c2. After queen c2, black should play queen e7, and will now follow the game Simagin Petrosian USSR 1966. White played f3, and now black played the key idea of the line c6, which intends to open up the centre with d5. This is an idea you have to remember in this line. White didn't like the unprotected bishop on e3, so he went bishop f2, and then came knight h5, zeroing in on the weakened f4 square. White kept black out with g3, and then black played knight d7, castles, knight e5, rook fe1, knight f6, king g2, c5. When white's knight moves, for instance to b5, black will follow up with bishop e6 and has active piece play. The white queen in this line really belongs on d2, supporting the bishop. Back to the position now after rook e8, and white almost always plays f3. This is the best move. Now comes c6, threatening, as I say, to open up the game with d5. A plausible move for white here is castles on the king side. But as we'll see, it's more accurate to play queen d2 first. We're now going to look at the game Klinger versus Dorfman, Belgrade 1988, where black exploited the fact that white's bishop on e3 was unprotected. Dorfman played d5. White played c takes d5, and now knight takes d5 was black's excellent reply. Klinger played knight takes d5, c takes d5, and then queen b3. Now came knight c6, rook a d1, and then bishop takes d4, bishop takes d4, knight takes d4, rook takes d4, queen f6, exclamation mark. The point being that if white now plays rook takes d5, then bishop e6 wins the exchange. Back now to the position after black's move c7 to c6, setting a sort of small trap. So if white castles, then you can play d5, exploiting the unprotected bishop. Queen d2 is the best move, and now black should play d5 anyway. We then have the line e takes d5, c takes d5, castles on the king side. And now we'll look at two games by world champion Garry Kasparov, in which black emerged with an excellent position. The first of these is the 11th game against Anatoly Karpov from the 1990 World Championship match, and we'll introduce the main idea using this game. After white castles, black plays knight c6, a move that was formerly regarded as dubious in view of the move c5. However, Kasparov had a new idea prepared, and that idea was rook takes e3, an interesting exchange sacrifice, queen takes e3, and then queen f8. Now at first sight it's not absolutely clear for what the material has been sacrificed, but if you look at it more closely you'll see that it's practically impossible for white to maintain a stable position in the centre. Black's immediate threat is knight g4. There are two moves for white worth consideration. The first of these, as Karpov plays, is knight takes c6, clarifying things. And black should recapture with the b-pawn. We'll now turn to analysis by Kasparov himself for illumination of what's really going on in the position. The first move he gives for white is a3. He doesn't regard this as particularly strong, and gives the following line. Bishop f5 by black, queen f2, knight d7, rook a c1, queen takes c5, queen takes c5, knight takes c5. And he feels that black has excellent compensation for the exchange here. Black has all the dark squares on the board and threatens, for instance, penetration with either rook b8 or knight b3. A sample of white's difficulties is illustrated by the move b4, when after knight b3, white has no convenient way to protect the knight on c3. The second move Kasparov considers is knight d1. The knight gets out of the way of the bishop on g7. And then he gives bishop f5 as black's best move, queen f2, knight d7, rook c1, a5, preventing white from playing b4, g4, trying to knock black's pieces off active squares, bishop e6, f4, knight f6, f5, knight e4, queen g2, bishop d7, king h1, and then rook e8, with, in Kasparov's words, unquestionable compensation for the exchange. Again, this compensation boils down to dark squares. For instance, black's already threatening the pawn on c5. If white tries to consolidate the queen side with b3, then bishop d4 is a strong move, just centralising, and black takes the pawn on c5 at his leisure. This position is interesting and, I think, perfectly playable for black. A third move given by Kasparov, and one which looks more natural to my eye anyway, is rook a c1. Then he gives bishop f5 again. This seems to be a key idea. b4, rook e8. If black's rook can't develop actively on the b file, then it might as well come to the e file. Queen d2, d4, exclamation mark, bringing black's bishop on g7 into the game. For instance, if queen takes d4, then either knight e4 or knight d5. Looks very strong. So, after d4, knight e4 by Kasparov is given. Bishop takes e4, f takes e4, knight takes e4, queen d3, and then bishop h6. Again with terrific compensation for the exchange. In fact, I think black is going to get the exchange back in this line, because bishop e3 is a threat, followed by, for instance, king h1, knight f2. Fourthly, and finally, rook a d1, trying to hold up the advance of black's d-pawn at some point. And then, rook b8, given by Kasparov, hitting the b-pawn, b3, rook b4, this idea of activating the rook will be seen in the main game as well, knight a4, bishop e6, rook f e1, knight d7, bishop f1, h5. This is all Kasparov's analysis. King h1, h4, bishop d3, knight e5, bishop c2, h3, g3, d4, another interesting move, unleashing the d pawn, queen f4, d3, another move given by Kasparov, queen takes b4, d takes c2, evaluated by the world champion as unclear. Well, that was a typical piece of mind-boggling analysis by Garry Kasparov. I mean, obviously this position's ridiculously unclear. The main thing about it is, I think over the board it's virtually impossible for White to defend, because he's got this monster c-pawn on c2. White's got to round that up for starters. And while he's rounding it up, Black is presumably going through with moves like knight takes f3 and bishop d5. I think if you really analyse this position or put it onto a computer, you might find a way for White to defend. But over the board, I mean, I assess Black's position is almost winning. He's got too many trumps, holding too many trumps for White to be able to defend comfortably. So there you are then, very difficult stuff. Karpov comes up with a move. I mean, obviously Karpov's a very suspicious player. He's tremendous at blotting out counter chances for the opponent. And he came up with king h1, just trying to calm things down a bit. Okay, now comes a familiar manoeuvre, rook b8. And after knight a4, Kasparov played rook b4. Then came b3 and bishop e6 by White. Knight b2, knight h5, knight d3, and then rook h4. Spectacular manoeuvre by Black's rook, coming over to attack the White king. The immediate threat, of course, is knight g3. Queen f2 happened. Black went queen e7, and the threat now is the very strong bishop d4. That would kill White off. So White tries to stop it with g4. Bishop d4 happened. Queen takes d4. Rook takes h2. And the game was agreed drawn, in view of king takes h2, queen h4 check, with perpetual. For instance, king g1, queen g3 check, king h1, queen h3 check. Actually, the more that you look at this game, and the more that you consider Kasparov's analysis, that was an excellent defensive performance by Karpov, under intense pressure. Well, now we move on to a game Gelfand-Kasparov, where one of the top players in the world tries to improve on White's play in this variation. Well, here we are, back at the position where Black has just played his queen to f8, and you'll recall that Karpov took the knight on c6. In the game Gelfand-Kasparov, Linares 1992, White played knight c to b5, trying to maintain a grip on the important d4 square. Black played queen takes c5, rook a c1, and now the important move queen b6, maintaining a pin on the knight at d4. And Gelfand played queen f2. Now obviously Gelfand had studied this position and had come to the conclusion that it was possible for White to not only defend the position, but to consolidate and go on to win the game. Kasparov had a different opinion, based on the fact that Black's pieces are still very active, and he's got one pawn for the exchange at this point. He just developed his pieces naturally. Bishop d7, rook f d1, rook e8, bishop f1, and then bishop h6. Now, if White plays f4, he dramatically weakens the squares e4 and g4. A top grandmaster would never ever consider such a move playable unless it was absolutely forced upon him. So Gelfand played rook c3. And then comes a move which Kasparov considers the most important of the game. Knight b4. He says that only this tactical resource enables black to maintain the balance. The Gligirit system has actually lost some of its popularity with the top players, perhaps because of active black tries like the ones we've just looked at. I think that the exchange sacrifice that Kasparov came up with against Karpov is still viable, but you need a good memory and you need to master the information on this tape in order to play it. If you do so, then your white opponents will be in a lot of danger. Now we come to the classical main line of the King's Indian, where white plays bishop e2, black plays e5, and white castles on the king's side. Now a lot of black players have put off playing this line because there's so much theory on it. Accordingly, I'm going to concentrate on a relatively modern idea, an idea of Grandmaster Igor Glek, and you'll see that it's quite a successful way for black to avoid all the mainline theory and still get a reasonable position. I'm going to recommend in this position black plays e takes d4, and after knight takes d4, play rook e8. White plays f3, and then comes Glek's characteristic move, knight c6. This is a completely new idea. Formerly, black played the move c6 here, intending d5. We've seen something similar in our recommendation against the Gligirit system. Now, because this is such a new system, I'll present here the available information to you with my observations. There are several moves for white in this position, the most common of which is bishop e3. Retracting that move, let's first of all consider the move knight c2. And we're going to follow the game Zagorskis Glek, played in Germany during 1994. After knight c2, black played knight h5. Now the good move here, that's a good move, grabbing the black squares on the king's side. I think left to his own devices, black will probably play something like queen h4, followed by bishop e5. This is the type of attack that black is hoping to initiate after knight h5. So white's got to be on his guard to stop that. Zagorski's played g4. A risky move, but he probably didn't want the bishop coming to e5 and the queen coming to h4, so he hopes to drive the knight back. And Glek played an interesting move now, bishop e5. The success of this move depends on the tactic. f4, which is probably bad for white, bishop takes c3, g takes h5, bishop to g7, h takes g6, h takes g6, when Glek assesses the position as better for black. And when you look at it, the thing that immediately strikes you is first of all the weakness of white's e-pawn, and secondly you wonder, where's white's g-pawn? Why has white weakened his king like this? So I reckon it's the weak white king which really gives black the advantage here. One other variation is important to examine is what happens after bishop e5 if white takes the knight on h5. Well, then black goes bishop takes h2 check, king takes h2, queen h4 check, and this position should be a draw. For instance, king g1, queen g3 check, king h1, queen h3 check, and a draw by perpetual. Retracting, after queen h4 check, if white had tried the silly king g2, then I think he actually loses. Bishop h3 check is a crusher. Now actually in the game Zagorski's Glek, something similar happened. White played knight d5, and black played the immediate bishop takes h2 check. So the same drawing mechanism applies. King takes h2, queen h4 check, king g1, queen g3 check, and here the two players agree to draw. Summing up, knight c2 doesn't pose any problems to a well-prepared black player. Back to the position now after knight c6, and in Fatachnik, Gleck, Germany 1994, white tried knight takes c6, b takes c6, and then bishop g5. Gleck played h6, Fatachnik dropped his bishop back to h4. Now comes g5, an interesting move, grabbing black squares. For instance, now the manoeuvre knight h5 to f4 has been nicely prepared. Fatachnik played bishop f2, and now Gleck recommends as best the move c5. c5 has the idea bishop b7, and then the manoeuvre knight d7 to e5, possibly knight c6, and then knight d4. Notice black's pawns, all on dark squares, controlling important central points. This gives him the time and the ability to go through with this long manoeuvre. I think if black plays c5, then he gets a good position. Clearly the most solid and the most common move you will encounter is bishop e3. I also think that's the most sensible move for white. White just reinforces the d4 knight and develops a piece. What could be simpler? And now Gleck recommends the move knight h5, in similar vein to the stuff we've just been looking at. Well, two moves have been played here, and we'll consider the solid move first. That is queen d2. So a nice developing move, a normal developing move. And I'm going to show you two ways for black against this move, then you can choose which you want to play. The first method is knight takes d4, with the idea bishop takes d4, knight f4. Black brings his knight immediately back into play and threatens to take off the bishop on e2 if necessary. If white now captures on g7, then I think black goes queen g5, a slightly surprising move, forcing white to find an only move here. Can you see it? That's the very uncomfortable king f2. But after that, well, black was threatening knight h3 check, winning the queen. But after that, I think king takes g7 is good for black, at least equal. So in the game Krivosey versus Golubev, Russia 1995, white didn't take on g7, he preferred the better move, king h1, after which black should simply take on e2 with equality. The second method for black, after queen d2, is the immediate knight f4. The difference being that this move allows white the chance to capture on c6 and double black's pawns. Well, let's see how that works out. Knight takes c6, and black must capture now on e2. Knight takes e2, check. Knight takes e2, and then b takes c6. Bishop d4. And we're now going to follow the game Sakaev versus Belov, Capet-Legrand, 1995. Black took the bishop with check. Bishop takes d4, check. And then came knight takes d4. Now key move, c5, grabbing dark squares. Black's bishop can cover the light squares. Okay, so let his pawns cover the dark squares. The second and more aggressive move for white after knight h5 is to play f4. And we'll now follow the game Van der Sterren versus Gleck, Bundesliga 1994. Black played knight f6, white played bishop f3, and now came the surprising move, given an exclamation mark by Gleck in his notes of the game, bishop g4. Point of this is that if now white captures on g4, bishop takes g4, then knight takes g4, queen takes g4, knight takes d4, or even bishop takes d4. Leaves white's pawn structure slightly overextended. This is easy equality for black, although probably I prefer to take on d4 with the knight. After bishop g4, Van der Sterren took on c6, knight takes c6. Black went bishop takes f3, queen takes f3, b takes c6. And Van der Sterren here played bishop d2. In a later game, Fatachnik Glek Vaikens 1995, Fatachnik tried rook a e1. After that, black played queen c8, a strong move given by Glek in his notes, intending queen g4, and white pushed on with e5. After d takes e5, queen takes c6, knight g4, a very, very murky position ensued, and the game was drawn on move 40. You can find this game in its entirety in the booklet. In the game Sholoshenkin Glek, Latuke 1994, white came up with a different move. He played bishop f2. Then came queen c8, as in the example we've just looked at, rook a e1, and black played queen g4, completely neutralising white's opening. We're back now at the game Van der Sterren Glek, and you'll recall that white has just played bishop d2. This time-consuming move was met accurately by Glek, queen b8. Now the point of this was that after b3, queen b6 check, king h1, Glek unleashed an interesting combination here. Knight takes e4. Well, white's got to take the knight, knight takes e4. And not bishop takes a1, as you might expect, but queen d4. This is a very cunning move. So now the knight is en prise. That's firmly en prise. If the knight moves, the bishop drops. There's pressure along the long diagonal to the rook on a1. So it's difficult for white to actually keep his pieces together, keep them all protected in this position, given that black's also threatening the move f5, which would undermine white's position. I think that's black's primary threat here, f5. Van der Sterren tried knight takes d6, c takes d6, rook a d1, and then came queen e4 by black. Now the best move here, which probably keeps a kind of uneasy equality, is bishop c3. But in the game, Van der Sterren blundered with rook d to e1. Then came queen takes f3, rook takes f3, rook takes e1 check, bishop takes e1, rook e8, bishop d2, and now entering white's position, Glek played rook e2. Then came rook to d3, and now c5. Another very strong move. The point being that after rook takes d6, then bishop d4 is exceptionally strong, because, well, where does the bishop go? There's nowhere to go here without a laying mate. If he plays bishop a5, rook takes a2, he's winning, threatening the bishop and checkmate on the back rank. So after c5, white's actually in quite a lot of trouble here, and he tried to free up his back rank with h3. Of course now white had to reckon with bishop d4, but there was nothing he could do about it. Van der Sterren tried to escape with b4, king f8, b5, king e7, and then he tried f5. Well, black played d5 in this position, with the idea that if c takes d5, then king d6, and black is actually getting his king in. He's going to win this endgame with the aid of his king. So after d5, Van der Sterren played f takes g6, h takes g6, bishop f4, trying to keep the black king out. But then d takes c4. Rook a3, rook b2, nice accurate move by black. Rook takes a7 check, king f6. That c pawn on c4 is going to win the game. The game didn't last much longer anyway. White went h4. Black started to round up white pawns with rook takes b5, bishop g5 check, king g7, a4, rook b1 check, king h2, and then finally c3. That pawn is going to cost white at least a piece, so he resigned in this position. The system with knight c6 is little known and very modern. You've just seen virtually all the information going on this particular system. I believe that it's a fundamentally sound system with good surprise value. I've really enjoyed putting together this repertoire for you. A lot of the lines that I recommend I've already been trying for a while with success, and those that I haven't yet tried I'll be trying as soon as possible in the international tournament arena. Best of luck with the King.